Dr. Carter's mind raced as she pieced together what little information she had. The signal was too specific, too directed. It wasn't just a distress call. It was an invitation to come and find it. But why would the ship, or whoever was aboard, want to lead someone back to it? And why had it waited so long to send the signal? These questions gnawed at her, and soon she found herself consumed by the mystery. She couldn't let it go. She knew she had to go to those coordinates to find out what had happened to the Orion and its crew, no matter the cost. Dr. Carter wasn't alone in her obsession. A small group of experts, engineers, and space navigators began to form around her, each of them eager to uncover the truth. They put together a plan, gathered the necessary resources, and within months, a new mission was launched. Their goal was clear: to find the Orion and bring it back, or at least to discover what had happened to it. The journey would take them deep into uncharted space, further than any human had ever traveled before. But the questions burned inside them. Had the Orion truly returned, or was something far darker at play? What had it encountered out there? And why was it now calling for help? Or was it? The closer they got to the coordinates, the more the tension grew. As the crew prepared to leave, a strange feeling settled over the team. The Orion had been gone for so long, yet the signal was still fresh in their minds, promising secrets beyond their understanding. No one knew exactly what they would find, but one thing was certain: the truth would change everything. The journey into the unknown was about to begin. The crew gathered in the small, dimly lit briefing room, their faces tense, reflecting the gravity of the mission they were about to embark on. The walls of the room were lined with maps of the star systems they would be passing through, and at the center, a hologram of the coordinates was projected, shimmering with distant light. The coordinates, as precise as they were, pointed to a place beyond anything humanity had ever charted, a star system so far out on the edge of known space that it bordered on the unknown. No manned mission had ever ventured so far, and no one could explain how the Orion could have traveled there, or why it would have waited this long to send a signal. Dr. Emily Carter stood before them, her hand shaking slightly as she adjusted the controls of the map. She had spent countless hours studying the strange signal, trying to understand the origin of the message, trying to find any pattern that would give them a clue as to where the Orion had been. But the signal was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't an emergency beacon, nor was it a distress call. There was no panicked voice from the crew, no last-minute plea for help. There was only silence, cold, eerie silence, interrupted only by those cryptic coordinates. But the ship's return, after all these years, couldn't be a coincidence. "How sure are we about these coordinates?" asked Lieutenant Daniel Gray, the mission's captain, his voice cutting through the thick silence. He looked directly at Dr. Carter, the only one in the room who seemed to understand the weight of what they were about to do. "Sure enough to risk our lives for it," Emily replied, her voice steady, but filled with an emotion she could barely keep in check. She had to believe the Orion had survived. She had to believe it. After all these years, there had to be something. Someone out there. The signal comes from a region of space known as the Oort cloud, at the outermost edge of our solar system. No human has ever gotten that far. The Orion. It could be waiting for us out there. The room fell into a deep silence as the crew processed the implications of Emily's words. There was no turning back. If they followed these coordinates, they would be venturing into the unknown, risking everything to discover what had happened to the Orion and its crew. The Orion had been Earth's pride, humanity's greatest hope, and now it had become a ghost story, a mystery that refused to die. "We're going to be the first to find out what happened," said Lieutenant Gray finally, his voice firm. "If the Orion is out there, we're going to bring it back, no matter the cost." The words echoed in the room, but they brought little comfort. The crew members exchanged uncertain glances, their minds racing with questions. What could they find out there? What had happened to the Orion? Was it really a rescue mission, or were they walking into something far more dangerous? The questions were endless, but one thing was certain: they would be the ones to answer them. The next few days were a blur of preparations. The team worked tirelessly to get the ship ready for its journey to the far reaches of space. The crew consisted of scientists, engineers, medical staff, and experienced pilots, all of whom were experts in their fields. But this was different. This mission was unlike any other. They weren't just going to explore an unknown planet or chart new territory. They were going to find the Orion, the ship that had been lost to time, and uncover the truth of its disappearance. The journey would take months, maybe even years, and they had no idea what they would find. Dr. Carter spent most of her time in the ship's control room, monitoring the navigation systems and reviewing the data. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, but the thought of the Orion, of the crew that might still be alive, waiting for rescue, kept her going. The signal had been sent for a reason. It was a message from the past, reaching out across the darkness of space, urging them to come closer. The question was why? Why now? What had happened to the ship? Was it the same Orion they had lost so many years ago, or had it changed into something else entirely? As they passed the outer edges of the solar system and entered the unknown territory beyond, the crew felt a growing sense of unease. The vast emptiness of space seemed to swallow them whole, and the further they traveled, the less they felt tethered to Earth. Days turned into weeks, and still, the signal led them onward. But the closer they got to the coordinates, the more the crew began to experience strange phenomena. At first, it was just small things: flickers in the ship's communication systems, glitches in the navigation display. But then, as they neared the star system where the signal originated, the anomalies grew more intense. The ship's systems started to behave erratically, as though they were being tampered with from the outside. The crew couldn't explain it, but they all felt it. Something was out there, something that was watching them. One night, as the ship entered the final stretch toward their destination, a strange humming noise filled the air. It was faint at first, like the buzz of distant machinery, but it quickly grew louder, vibrating through the very bones of the ship. The crew scrambled to identify the source, but there was no clear answer. The hum seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, pulsing in time with the ship's own engines. It was as though the ship itself was trying to communicate with them. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that made every heartbeat feel louder, more intense. The crew members exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if they were truly ready to face whatever awaited them at the end of their journey. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The coordinates led them to a barren, desolate world, a lifeless planet on the edge of the star system. There was nothing here, no signs of life, no signs of the Orion. But as they descended toward the surface, a flicker of movement caught their attention. The ship's radar picked up an object, massive, hidden beneath layers of dust and rock. It was the Orion, unmistakable in its size and shape. It was buried, half destroyed, and covered in strange markings that none of them could recognize. But it was there. The crew's breath caught in their throats as they realized the truth. The Orion had returned, but not as they had known it. Something had changed. Something had altered the ship beyond recognition. They were about to step into a world of mystery, of danger, and of answers that could alter the course of humanity forever. And the most terrifying part, they still had no idea what had happened to the crew of the Orion, and whether they would ever leave this planet alive. The planet was a desolate wasteland, its surface littered with craters and jagged rock formations that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. A thick, yellowish mist hung in the air, swirling slowly in the stillness as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The Orion lay in the distance, partially obscured by a rise in the rocky terrain. Its once pristine hull now bore the marks of time and damage, deep gouges, scorch marks, and strange symbols etched into the surface of the ship. It was clear that something had happened to it, something beyond the normal wear and tear of space travel. Dr. Emily Carter stood at the ship's entrance, staring at the distant silhouette of the Orion against the backdrop of a lifeless sky. She felt a mixture of awe and dread, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything would change. She had spent years thinking about this ship, wondering if it would ever be found. And now it was here. But what had happened to it? Why had it returned in such a state? And more importantly, where were the crew? Lieutenant Daniel Gray, the captain, stood next to Emily, looking just as uneasy. "We don't know what we're walking into, Emily," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the Orion. "We have no idea what happened to the crew or what they encountered. This could be a trap, or worse, it could be something we're not ready to deal with." "I know," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to know. We have to find out what happened here." She paused, taking a deep breath as she tried to steady her nerves. This is humanity's greatest mystery. We can't just leave it unsolved. The airlock doors of their ship opened with a soft hiss, and the crew began to move toward the Orion. As they approached, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. Every step felt like it took them deeper into the unknown, and each member of the crew was acutely aware that they were crossing a threshold that no one had dared to cross before. They were about to board a ship that had vanished for over 10 years, a ship that had returned with no explanation, no sign of its crew. They were stepping into a mystery that could change the course of human history, or end it. The surface of the Orion was cold, its once sleek exterior now rough and weathered. The strange markings etched into the hull were unlike anything the crew had ever seen, glowing faintly in the dim light, almost as though they were alive, pulsating with an eerie energy. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. They all felt it. The ship was different. It was no longer the Orion they had known. This was something else, something far more dangerous. As they entered the airlock, a low hum reverberated through the walls, almost as if the ship was waking up. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The feeling of being watched intensified, and she couldn't shake the sensation that the Orion itself was alive, aware of their presence. The ship's systems powered up with a flicker of lights, and the doors to the interior opened slowly, revealing the dark, hollow corridors beyond. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with dust and stale air. The lights flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The ship's once gleaming hallways were now covered in grime and debris. Everything was eerily silent, as though the ship had been abandoned for far longer than the few years it had been missing. But there were no signs of the crew, no personal belongings, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply vanished, leaving nothing behind. Emily stepped forward, her footsteps echoing loudly in the quiet. "Keep your eyes open," she ordered the crew. "Stay close, and be prepared for anything." They moved through the corridors cautiously, the eerie silence pressing in on them from all sides. The ship's strange symbols seemed to be everywhere, etched into the walls, the floors, even the ceilings. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of them, but they were unlike any language or script she had ever encountered. Whatever had happened to the Orion, it was clear that it had been changed, transformed into something new, something dangerous. As they made their way deeper into the ship, they reached the control room. The door slid open with a faint hiss, revealing a darkened room filled with rows of monitors and blinking consoles. The crew gathered around, their eyes scanning the control panels for any sign of the crew. But again, there was nothing. No signs of life, no personal items, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there in years. Emily stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the console. She hesitated for a moment before activating the ship's systems. The screens flickered to life, and a series of cryptic symbols appeared on the main monitor. They were similar to the ones they had seen etched into the ship's walls, but now they were flashing rapidly, almost as though they were trying to communicate. "What is this?" Lieutenant Gray asked, his voice low and filled with apprehension. "I don't know," Emily replied. her brow furrowing as she tried to decipher the symbols. "It's some sort of code, but it's not like anything I've ever seen. This ship, it's communicating with us, but I don't understand what it's saying." Suddenly, the hum that had been reverberating through the ship grew louder, more insistent. The lights flickered once again, and the temperature in the room dropped. A chill ran down Emily's spine. She could feel it now, a presence, something on the ship that wasn't human, something that had been waiting for them. But what was it? Before anyone could respond, the screen flickered again, and a new image appeared. This time, it was a video feed, a distorted, shaky recording. The image was unclear at first, but then it focused, revealing a figure standing in the control room. It was one of the crew members from the Orion, but something was terribly wrong. The figure's face was pale, its eyes wide and unblinking, and its body seemed to twitch unnaturally, as if it was being controlled by an outside force. The figure reached out toward the camera, its hand trembling, before the video feed cut out abruptly. The crew stood frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process what they had just seen. The figure on the screen was human, but it was not human. It was as if some force, had taken control of the crew, twisting them into something else. That wasn't normal," Lieutenant Gray said, his voice filled with disbelief. Emily could only nod, her heart racing. "No," she whispered, "it wasn't. The ship was alive with something that was beyond their understanding, and whatever force had taken over the Orion was not finished yet. They had only just begun to uncover the terrifying truth." The crew had no idea what they had walked into, but one thing was certain: they were in the grip of something far older and more powerful than anything humanity had ever known, and the Orion's secret was only just beginning to unfold. The crew's heartbeats echoed in the eerie silence of the Orion as they stood in the control room, staring at the distorted video feed. The crew member's pale, twitching face still haunted Emily's mind. The fact that it was human, yet not, sent a chill down her spine. What had happened to them? How could this person, if it was even still a person, be so fundamentally altered? "We need to find out more," Dr. Emily Carter said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, though she felt a growing sense of unease. This ship wasn't just abandoned, it was a warning. That figure on the screen, it was trying to communicate something. Lieutenant Daniel Gray looked at the video feed again, his eyes narrowing in concern. "That wasn't any message I've ever seen before. It looked more like a warning. And those symbols, they're not from any language we know." The screen flickered again, but this time it didn't show a video. Instead, an unfamiliar symbol appeared at the center of the monitor, glowing a faint blue. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, slowly intensifying. The humming sound from earlier began again, but louder this time, vibrating through the walls of the ship. It was as though the Orion was trying to speak, or perhaps to beckon them further in. Emily instinctively stepped closer to the monitor, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "This ship isn't just broken," she muttered, almost to herself. "It's alive, and whatever's controlling it, it wants us here. It's leading us somewhere." "But where?" asked Lieutenant Gray, his voice tight with unease. He could feel it now, that sense of being watched, being manipulated by forces far beyond their control. The deeper they ventured, the more the ship seemed to bend to an unknown will, as if it had its own agenda. "We'll find out," Emily replied, her resolve hardening. The crew had come this far. They couldn't turn back now. They needed answers, and the Orion was the only way they were going to get them. The crew moved cautiously, following Emily as she led the way deeper into the ship. The corridors became more alien with every step. The walls, once sleek and metallic, now appeared to be growing, twisting, shifting with strange organic patterns. The further they went, the more the ship seemed to pulse with life, as though it was reacting to their presence. Every flicker of light, every creak and groan of the ship's structure, felt like the breath of something ancient, something that had been dormant for far too long. They reached the central chamber of the Orion, a vast, dark space that was only dimly lit by the faint glow of the strange symbols. The walls were lined with machines that hummed with an eerie, almost mechanical rhythm. It was here that Emily felt the full weight of the ship's unnatural presence. It was as if this room was the heart of the Orion, the very center of whatever force had taken control of it. At the center of the room stood a massive cylindrical structure, pulsing with the same rhythmic glow. It was unlike anything the crew had ever seen, an alien design that seemed to defy the principles of physics. It was both mechanical and organic, as though the two had merged into a single entity. Emily approached the structure slowly, her fingers brushing against its surface. It was warm to the touch, almost alive, and her skin tingled with an energy she couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, a low voice echoed through the room. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was more like a thought, a whisper inside their minds. At first, it was indecipherable, a jumble of foreign sounds, but as it continued, the crew began to understand. "You are here. You have come." The voice was deep and resonant, filled with an ancient power that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The words weren't directed at any one person. They were meant for everyone. A collective message, as though the ship itself were speaking to them. But the more they listened, the more they realized that the message wasn't just a greeting. It was a warning. "You do not understand. You will. Soon." The voice grew fainter, but it was clear. The ship was communicating with them. It knew they were there. And it wanted them to understand something they couldn't yet grasp. "What the hell is that?" Lieutenant Gray whispered, his voice shaky. He looked at Emily, his fear evident. "What is it trying to tell us?" Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was no ordinary ship. The Orion wasn't just a vessel. It was something more, something ancient. It had been changed, altered by whatever it had encountered out there in the unknown reaches of space. It had become a conduit for something beyond human comprehension. "We need to access the ship's mainframe," Emily said, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "I think we can learn more about what happened to the crew, why it's changed like this. There's a control center deeper in the ship. If we can get there, we might find the answers we're looking for." The crew nodded grimly, though their apprehension was palpable. They had no idea what they would find. Every step they took brought them closer to an unknown danger, to a force that seemed far older and more powerful than anything they could imagine. Yet they couldn't turn back. The Orion had called them here for a reason, and they were determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As they moved deeper into the heart of the ship, the corridors seemed to stretch on forever. The walls continued to twist and warp, almost as if they were shifting in response to their presence. Strange whispers echoed from the shadows, voices that seemed to come from all around them, urging them onward. They reached the control center at last, a massive chamber filled with more of the strange alien technology. The air was thick with an electric charge, and the walls were alive with a pulsating light. The central console was unlike anything they had seen before, a mass of interconnected wires and glowing panels, all working in unison to keep the ship's systems active. Emily approached the console and began to interface with it, her hands flying over the controls as she tried to make sense of the data. The screen flickered to life, showing a series of images of the Orion's original crew. They were alive in the footage, but their eyes were vacant, their movements stiff and mechanical, as if they were being controlled by something else. Then the images shifted. The crew saw a new scene, one that sent a shockwave of terror through their bodies. The footage showed the Orion's crew encountering something in the depths of space. It was a being, massive, unrecognizable, its form shifting and warping like liquid. The crew seemed to be mesmerized by it, their bodies moving involuntarily toward the entity. It was clear that the Orion had been altered by whatever they had encountered. The creature reached out with tendrils of light, and in the blink of an eye, it enveloped the crew, merging with them. taking control of their bodies. The footage stopped abruptly, leaving only a haunting image of the ship's crew, altered, twisted, and changed forever. The last message on the screen read, "You cannot escape what has already been taken." Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the full extent of what had happened to the Orion. The crew hadn't been lost. They had been taken. And now, the entity that had altered them was waiting, hungry for more. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a prison, a trap designed to lure in the unwary, to claim more souls to grow. And now, the crew of the Orion was coming for them. The crew stood frozen, the reality of what they had just uncovered sinking in like a cold weight. The Orion had not been lost. It had been claimed. The footage they had seen, those pale, vacant-eyed crew members, was a nightmare they couldn't escape. They weren't just missing. They were consumed by something far older, more powerful, and far more dangerous than anything humanity had ever encountered. "We need to get out of here," Lieutenant Gray said, his voice shaky, the calm authority he normally projected now replaced by a rising panic. His eyes darted toward the door, as though expecting something to come rushing in. The walls of the room seemed to pulse, their strange markings glowing brighter, more insistent. Emily turned to face him, her own heart pounding in her chest. "We can't leave yet," she said, her voice firm but strained. "We need to know everything. We need to understand what's happened here." Her words felt hollow even as they left her lips. She wasn't sure if it was the truth she needed, or if it was the fear of the unknown that kept her moving forward. They were already too deep in it. "We're not prepared for this, Emily," Gray snapped, his eyes darting nervously as the hum of the ship grew louder, the vibrations rattling their bones. "Whatever this is, whatever's inside the ship, it's not just going to let us leave." His words hit home. She could feel the presence now, stronger than ever, as though it was seeping into her skin, into her thoughts. The ship was alive, yes, but not in the way they had thought. The Orion wasn't just a vessel. It was a conduit, a vessel for something that had been waiting in the deep recesses of space, dormant for centuries, perhaps millennia. And now, it was awake, and it was hungry. Emily swallowed hard. "I know, but we don't have a choice. If we leave now, we may never understand what happened to the crew, and we may never be able to stop it." Gray didn't respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the door, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. But Emily saw the hesitation in his eyes. She knew he understood the gravity of the situation. They were on the brink of something that could change the course of human history forever, and to survive, they had to confront it head-on. The sound of the ship's hum intensified once again, growing louder, more intense, as if it were feeding off their fear. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the chamber. It wasn't just the ship that was alive. It was the very environment around them. The walls seemed to shift. The floor beneath their feet felt unstable, as if the ship was changing its shape, adapting to their presence. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway beyond. The sound was like the slamming of a massive door, and it sent the crew into immediate alert. Emily motioned for them to be silent, her eyes narrowing as she strained to hear. The hum of the ship had stopped, replaced by a low guttural sound, something that wasn't human, something that didn't belong. "Move," Emily commanded, her voice urgent. The crew responded instinctively, heading toward the back of the room, their weapons raised, their senses alert to every creak and groan of the ship. They were close, too close, and Emily knew that whatever had happened to the crew of the Orion, it was happening to them too. The strange force was pulling them in, bending their minds, their bodies, trying to warp them into something else. The strange symbols on the walls began to glow more brightly, their light pulsing in time with the eerie sound. As they moved through the hallways, they found the ship had changed. The corridors were narrower, twisting, and winding in unnatural ways, as though the ship itself was becoming a maze designed to confuse them, to trap them. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of dread that pressed in on them from all sides. They could hear the sounds now. Soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. But it felt like a warning, like a promise. Suddenly, a loud screech filled the air, and the walls around them seemed to convulse. The sound was so shrill it made their teeth ache, and they instinctively covered their ears. The ship was alive. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It had become something else. It had become an entity, a massive, twisting thing with its own consciousness, its own purpose. And that purpose wasn't to let them leave. Keep moving. Lieutenant Gray shouted over the noise, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the nearest exit. But the walls were closing in. The ship was shifting again. It was trapping them. They turned a corner and suddenly stopped dead in their tracks. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, a human figure, but twisted and wrong. It was one of the Orion's crew, but its body was warped, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Its eyes were wide, vacant, but there was a faint flicker of recognition in them. It was the same crew member they had seen in the video feed earlier, the one whose face had been so horribly contorted. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers stretched toward them, its mouth opening in a silent scream. And then, in an instant, it lunged. Emily's heart stopped as she watched the creature move. It was impossibly fast, its body contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The crew scattered in all directions, but the creature was everywhere, its twisted form moving through the hallways like a shadow, too fast, too unpredictable. They could hear its screeches, the sound echoing through the narrow, shifting corridors. It wasn't just one creature. There were more. Dozens of them. Twisted remnants of the Orion's crew. Their bodies altered, their minds consumed by whatever force had taken over the ship. The crew ran, but the walls kept closing in, the ship's twisting corridors forcing them into an ever-tightening trap. Emily's breath came in sharp gasps as she pushed forward, adrenaline flooding her veins. They couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving. They had to survive. But the Orion was no longer a ship. It was a prison, the living, breathing entity, and they were its prey. Get to the escape pods, Lieutenant Gray shouted, his voice strained, almost frantic. They were nearing the central docking bay, but the creature was right behind them, its twisted form appearing out of the shadows, always just a step too close. As they reached the docking bay, Emily turned back to face the creature, her breath catching in her throat. It was nearly upon them. She could feel the heat of its breath on her neck, the icy tendrils of its presence reaching into her mind. The Orion had claimed the crew, and now it wanted them too. Without thinking, she reached for the emergency override on the escape pod controls. She had to get them out of here. They had to leave. But as her hand touched the controls, the ship convulsed again, and everything went dark. The last thing Emily heard before everything went black was the voice, the deep, resonant voice that had spoken to them earlier. This time, it wasn't a whisper, it was a command. You cannot escape what has already been taken. And then, all was silent. The darkness was thick, suffocating, like the very air had turned into something else, something that clung to their skin and made it hard to breathe. Emily's eyes fluttered open, but the world around her remained an impenetrable black. Her head throbbed, a dull, pulsing pain at the back of her skull. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here. Had they escaped? Had they been taken? Slowly, she pushed herself to her feet, the weight of uncertainty settling over her. The sounds of her breath were the only thing she could hear. No hum of the ship, no screeching creatures, just silence. Emily, a voice whispered, shaky and tentative. It was Lieutenant Gray. She didn't know if it was relief or dread. She felt as his voice cut through the blackness. Are you all right? Yeah, she muttered, though the words felt hollow. I think so. She reached out, her hand brushing against cold metal. The walls. They were still in the ship. The Orion had not let them leave, not yet. It was too quiet, too still. But it didn't feel safe. The silence was unnatural, as if the ship were holding its breath, waiting. Gray's figure appeared beside her, his face pale in the darkness, his eyes scanning the empty room. Where are we? The escape pod. It didn't launch, did it? Emily's heart sank as she realized the truth. They hadn't made it. The ship had intervened. It had stopped them from escaping. No matter how much they struggled, how far they ran, they couldn't get away from it. The Orion was alive, and it didn't want them to leave. "We're in the maintenance corridor," Emily said, trying to steady her breathing. "We must have gotten knocked unconscious when it shifted." She couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. When it attacked, she didn't want to think about the shape of those creatures, the twisted remains of the original crew, hunting them. But as much as she didn't want to think about it, the images flooded back, the horrible faces of the altered crew, their eyes lifeless, their movements jerky, and then the creature that had chased them down. It was clear now that the Orion was more than just a ship. It was a weapon. It had been transformed, weaponized by whatever ancient force had taken over. Do you think they're all like that?" Gray whispered, his voice barely audible. The question haunted her. She couldn't imagine what they had done to the crew to turn them into those things. And yet, she knew they couldn't escape until they found out. The Orion had a purpose. It wasn't just a lost ship. It was a vessel of something much darker, and its mission was only beginning. "We need to move," Emily said, her voice low but filled with urgency. "We need to find the control center again, figure out what's happening. If we don't, we won't just be the last survivors. We'll be part of it." Gray nodded, though his expression was one of growing dread. "You think it wants us to join them? Become like them?" He looked around, as if the walls might suddenly close in on them. The thought was enough to freeze the blood in their veins. "I don't know, but I think we're running out of time." With no more words, they pushed forward, moving cautiously through the darkness. The maintenance corridors were cramped and twisted, the path barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. The further they ventured, the more they could feel the ship shifting beneath their feet, groaning as though it were alive and aware of their every move. It was as if it were tracking them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The corridor led them to a door, heavy and sealed shut, with strange alien symbols etched into its surface. It was unlike any other door they had encountered on the Orion. This one seemed more intentional, more alive. It hummed with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand on end. "This is it," Emily whispered, her hand hovering over the control panel next to the door. "This is where we need to be." Lieutenant Gray didn't argue. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a spark of determination in them. They didn't have a choice. They had to keep going. They had to face whatever the ship was hiding, whatever it was doing to them. Emily pressed the panel, and the door slid open with an unsettling hiss, revealing a massive chamber beyond. Inside, the air was thick with an alien metallic scent, and the walls were covered with glowing lines and symbols that pulsed in a rhythmic pattern. It was like stepping into the heart of the Orion, the very center of its dark power. At the far end of the room stood a massive console, unlike anything they had seen before. It was a fusion of organic and mechanical, the surface of it shimmering with the same symbols that had appeared throughout the ship. This was the source of the ship's life, the center of the force that controlled it all. As Emily stepped forward, a sudden voice echoed through the room, low, deep, resonant. It wasn't a voice she could hear with her ears, but one that seemed to speak directly into her mind, like a thought. "You have arrived." Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was the same voice they had heard before, the voice of the entity controlling the Orion. But now it felt closer, more personal, like it was speaking directly to her. "You are part of the process now. There is no going back." Her heart raced. This was it. The truth. The ship was more than a tool. It was part of something else, something ancient, something beyond human understanding. The ship itself had become the vessel for this entity, and it was changing them, adapting them into something new, something alien. And they were its next subjects. "We need to destroy this thing," Gray said, his voice urgent but trembling. "Whatever this is, it's not just a ship, it's an infection. We can't let it spread." Emily didn't respond immediately. She was too lost in the dark realization that had just hit her. The Orion wasn't just a ship. It was a parasite, a creature that consumed other ships, other life forms, and made them part of its own twisted network. And now, the crew of the Orion wasn't just in danger of being killed. They were being changed, altered into something that would never be human again. There was no escaping this. They were part of it now. Emily's thoughts raced, but her decision was clear. "We have to find a way to shut this down. Now." Gray nodded, his face hardening with resolve. "Let's finish this." But before they could act, the lights in the room flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward them. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their bodies, making their muscles tense with fear. And then, the door behind them slammed shut. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. A figure, familiar yet distorted, stepped forward. It was one of the altered crew members, their body warped beyond recognition. Its eyes locked onto Emily's, and for a brief moment, she swore she saw recognition, human recognition, in its gaze. But then the figure lunged. "Run!" Emily screamed. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pulsing with an unnatural energy as the altered crew member, once human, now advanced toward Emily and Lieutenant Gray. Its twisted body moved with jerky, unnerving precision, its hollow eyes fixed on them like a predator stalking its prey. It had been one of them, one of the Orion's original crew, but now it was just a shell of a person, consumed by whatever malevolent force had taken over the ship. "Move!" Emily shouted, her voice tight with panic. She didn't wait for a response. The creature was too close now, and every instinct told her to run. She grabbed Gray's arm and yanked him toward the door, but it was already too late. The creature was faster than she had anticipated, its long, spindly fingers reaching out toward them with terrifying speed. In a split second, the thing lunged, its claws slashing through the air, narrowly missing them both. Emily felt the cold rush of air as the creature's hand brushed past her, the sharpness of its nails grazing her cheek. She didn't hesitate. She pushed forward, adrenaline flooding her veins, her heart hammering in her chest. Gray was beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't falter. Together, they sprinted down the dark corridor, their footsteps echoing off the walls, the sound almost deafening in the silence that followed them. Emily's mind raced. What had happened to the Orion? What kind of force had taken over this ship and transformed its crew into this? The hallway twisted, turning at odd angles as if the ship itself was deliberately disorienting them. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing as they moved, forcing them into tighter and tighter spaces. The ship was no longer just a machine. It was an intelligent, living entity, and it had changed the very layout of its interior to trap them. Behind them, they could hear the creature's screeches, growing louder with each passing moment. The sound was a horrible mix of human and something else, a high-pitched wail that chilled Emily to her core. She had no doubt now. Whatever had overtaken the crew of the Orion wasn't just a parasite. It was a force, ancient and powerful, that fed on the ship's inhabitants, twisting them into something new, something dark. "Where are we going?" Gray shouted over the chaos, his face a mask of fear and determination. Emily's eyes darted to the rapidly shifting hallways. They had to get out, but the escape pods were a distant dream now. There was no escape from the Orion, not unless they understood what had happened to it, to its crew. They needed to stop the source, the heart of the ship, before it consumed them as well. "We need to find the control room," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "That's where this all started. We need to stop whatever is controlling the ship, or we'll be next. Do you think that'll work? Gray asked, his voice tinged with doubt as they rounded another corner, only to be greeted by another hallway that stretched endlessly in front of them. I don't know, Emily admitted, but there was no other choice. The path behind them was closing. The creature was growing closer. But it's our only chance. They moved faster now, the ship itself seeming to slow their every step, like it was trying to keep them from reaching the heart of its power. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every turn, the air growing colder, heavier. Emily could feel it. The ship was alive, and it was hunting them, just as it had hunted the original crew. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash rang out from behind them. A metal door slammed open with such force that it sent a shockwave through the corridor. Emily turned, instinctively reaching for her weapon. But before she could even react, she saw what had caused the noise. Another crew member, no, not a crew member anymore, stepped into view, its body even more grotesque than the first. Its face was a twisted mask of agony, half human and half something else, its eyes vacant and unseeing. It moved slowly, deliberately, its mouth hanging open as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the air around it shimmered, as if the very atmosphere was being distorted by its presence. "Keep moving," Emily screamed, but Gray was already pulling ahead, not daring to stop. They didn't have time for questions. They didn't have time to think about what these creatures were becoming. All that mattered now was survival. They sprinted through the shifting corridors, the creature not far behind them. As they turned a corner, Emily saw it. An elevator shaft, a way to ascend to the upper levels of the ship. It was their only hope. If they could get to the bridge, they could find out what had happened, maybe even figure out how to end this nightmare. But as they